So, Matt, how many people call you like Matt Luder or some other weird pronunciation of your name? Because literally everyone that I work with, I think you're the only one that can say my name correctly.
Yeah, I have the benefit of working with quite a few people called Omani, so I'm well schooled in not to say O'Mahony or whatever people say. O'Mahony. What do you get?
I get like some people can't say
O'Mahony, right?
It's O'Mahony, so like, or it's like O'Mahony. I get the Americans. There's no E in it, so it's O'Mahony.
O'Mahony,
true blue Irish.
Yeah, I got
fuck off, Matt.
I got Loader for a while because there was a guy who was on MTV called Kurt Loder with 1D.
Yep.
So I
host
got
of MTV Rocks.
Yeah, so I got called Loader occasionally, but I've generally been pretty lucky with that.
Yeah, and perfect way into our episode because it starts with a correction, a historical misnomer, literally. Matt, do you want to introduce our topic and why we've opened with this?
Well, yeah. So we've been talking about doing talking about artists who've influenced tattooing, and this topic of today's episode has been top of our list for very early on, and there is a big discussion about whether his name should be pronounced Giga or Geiger, and our guest today, Miroslava Hartman, who will give her biography in a minute, schools us and tells us the definitive answer. Miro, what is the correct pronunciation?
Well, the correct pronunciation is most definitely Giga. I have it on authority from the H.R. Giga Museum and the H.R. Giga Estate. And the reason that Geiger has caught on as badly as it has is because that is how he was announced at the 1980 Oscars when he collected the Oscar for Best Visual Effects for the 1979 Alien film directed by Ridley Scott. So the Americans are to blame for this, as well as other things. So we are trying to course correct, and of course we will stick to HR Giga, HRG. It's all good as long as it's not Geiger.
And tell us about yourself. So, like, what authority do you have to talk about this Swiss artist as...
Good question. So my name is Miroslava Hartman. I'm an art advisor, curator, and a creative consultant, and I've been working with the Giga Estate since about 2015 when we started putting together the first retrospective of his work in Ukraine. And we were working towards 2019, which was the 40th anniversary of the Alien movie. And it was a breakthrough project because it was the first time that Swiss government funding was given to support an exhibition of Giga's. He kind of famously has a really difficult relationship with the Swiss establishment. So the Swiss embassy in Ukraine on board to give us the chance to use, diplomatic cargo to be able to get the art in and out of the country. And it was, an incredible exhibition that took place at the Dovzhenko Center in Kiev in 2019, and it was very well attended. And I saw just how much of a cult following Giga continues to have, and especially really in the former Eastern Bloc. We'll talk about the Polish tattooing scene at some point, I think. It's certainly in Ukraine. My first introduction to Giga was from a Romanian translation of his famous ARH plus Taschen book. So it certainly filtered through the Iron Curtain.
Well, yeah, because I told you this when we were chatting recently. I had the Death Machine poster on my wall at university. And obviously, huge fan of Alien and, later on all the Jodorowsky crossovers and all the kind of things that would come later on. So it's such a pleasure to be talking to you about all this stuff, because Giger's one of those artists, right, who lots of people know a little bit about him, and I'll count myself in that group, but not many people know a lot about him. And certainly if they have an idea of his work, it is as the guy who did the Aliens, and probably not a huge amount more, really, right? Would that be a fair thing to say? Like, I think that he has a big reputation, but probably for quite a limited slice of his work, right?
It's fair to say that The Alien Creature is his most famous work. And it's I think that film is actually now part of the National Film Registry, like it's preserved for Armageddon and stuff like that. So it's something that I think most people are aware of, the alien. So the best way to tell people who Giger is to say, oh, he's the guy who did the alien.
I'm sure Giger would have had like very interesting thoughts about his creature being preserved for Armageddon.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I think, that reflects, the alien is maybe 20% of his overall body of work over the years. And the really interesting thing about him is that he returned to the same topics over and over again, the same themes. So we see the same themes running through his work from the late 50s, kind of when he started, and all the way through to his death in 2014. So actually, the alien creature evolved as a concept, through the decades, but it's really that 1979 iteration of it that really kind of tapped into the zeitgeist and became part of the international subconscious almost.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like it's probably a topic for another podcast, but this if listeners haven't seen the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune about the abortive attempt to make Dune, the first Dune film in 76, was it, or maybe even 75, when they came together.
Greatest movie never made. Greatest movie never made.
Yeah, but out of the ashes of that absurd project came some of the team at least, including Giger and Dan O'Bannon and Möbius and stuff, who would go on to work on Alien. But I guess like before, again, my limited knowledge, like what's his story before then? Like before he kind of becomes this, kind of eager young, broke ass guy coming to London to work with Jodorowsky. In the mid-70s, what's his story? Like, where does he come from, and how does this kind of style develop? Because it's an all horrible cliche, and actually Tom and I were talking to our friend Paul about this the other day, this cliche of like before his time. But I think Giger's very responsible in lots of ways, and certainly as we come to talk about tattooing, I think this is true, for like creating the aesthetic of a huge period of the 80s and 90s, wittingly or unwittingly. But I'm interested in where it comes from.
I would argue with you, Matt, that while his art is ahead of its time, I think it is perfectly of its time as well in like what it's trying to convey. Like I think he like perfectly captured a lot of the anxieties of the time in a way that no other artist would do. And it's funny, like everyone mentions Alien. Like my intro to Giger is through Carcass's Heartwork album. He did like all his like work with like Celtic Frost, Carcass, famously designing a microphone stand for Jonathan Davis from Korn, like through music, and then through Alien, because I didn't see Alien till I was like 23.
Yeah, I didn't see Alien until my kind of mid-20s. So my exposure to Alien came way after I saw all his other stuff. So I never saw him through that prism. But it's fair to say that Giger is very much a part of the visual culture of heavy music. I mean, going all the way back to the 60s and 70s. The other quite famous example is Brain Salad Surgery, Emerson Palmer. And actually, both of the paintings that became the cover artwork were stolen in Prague, and they are still missing.
No.
Yeah, and so in some of the tattooing magazines that we've been kindly sent by the H.R. Giger archive, you can see that they're looking for those paintings, and there's a $10,000 reward out new to them. Yeah, so very coveted. Fun fact, Jonathan Davis's Egyptian mic stand is going on display in Paris at the Philharmonic in April.
Oh, cool.
They're going to do this amazing review of basically like the visual culture and anthropology of metal, and it's part of a trilogy of exhibitions. They had one on electronic music and one on hip hop, so now metal is like the third chapter. So I'm really looking forward to that. So that's going on loan. That was one of the works that they're borrowing from the museum, which was super cool. Yeah, music, absolutely. And actually, I was at Cosmic Void Festival in London in sort of late September, and the number of people that I saw kind of carrying Giga on their flesh at this, underground black metal festival just goes to show that so many people know who Giga is if they're into certain things. It's like, if you're into tattooing, you know who Giga is. If you're into horror films or sci-fi, you know who Giga is. If you're into heavy music, you know who Giga is. The list goes on, So he is like the center of a moving wheel, which is kind of touching on Krakauer's theory, which got cited in an article about Joy Division, how they are the center of a moving wheel. Like so many things lead to Joy Division from other parts of, the culture. And Giga's very much like that. And I think it's time to reappraise his legacy as not just, the guy who did album covers or inspired awesome hats, but really to see him on his own merit in his own terms as one of the most incredible voices of the 20th century in visual culture. And that goes across the different mediums.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that I find interesting about what you're starting to do and have been doing already, Miro, which is like to try and take Giga seriously as an artist, because he has been this kind of cultural figure, although not particularly kind of acknowledged by any kind of mainstream institutional art, context, at least not in any kind of depth. I mean, so where does he? So what's his background? So he's Swiss. Like, where does this stuff come from? I guess, like historically, aesthetically, like what's his story in his early life?
Absolutely. Well, he was born in 1940 in Chur in Switzerland, and his parents were a lovely bourgeois couple that initially support his ambitions to become an artist, which in his father's eyes was synonymous with whoremonger and layabout. His pharmacist, he held a pharmacy. He was also the chief of the local Alpine rescue squad, so like an upstanding figure in the local community. And so when his son expressed the desire to become an artist, he promptly sent him to an industrial design college.
Very Swiss.
He apprenticed with an architect as well, and one of sort of his early tasks was to create drawings of Gothic churches and elements of Gothic churches that were going to undergo restoration.
Wow.
So a lot of what we see in his work, that kind of architectural sensibility, that world building sensibility, that kind of Gothic sweeping vertical, all of that comes from his training. So I imagine that had he not received that training, he might not have actually had the faculties to do what he went on to do. His mother, Melly Giga, was really supportive of his work, and quite famously, she put one of his early paintings of kind of apocalyptic landscapes in a gilt frame and displayed it in the house. And there's some lovely documentary footage of kind of Giga once he became quite infamous, shall we say, an interview with his parents being like, so what do you make of all of this? And they're like, So it didn't come from the family, although an interesting fact that I discovered quite recently was that he actually had some Indian heritage. So his great grandmother on his father's side came from India. And a lot of his, especially like the work that he did in the 80s, the Victory series, these kind of really sexual women in red tones viewed, either as if during the act or as if by a newborn baby coming, out of the woman. A lot of them seem to mirror the kind of the contours of Indian temples. So there is something to be said about ancestral memory. Like, I'm not saying let's go new age on this, but there is something coming through in his work that is not quite European, is not quite Swiss, but is rather, something a bit more ancient.
Yeah, and I think it actually, talking about him, the whole like idea of the body as a machine and prenatal memory and stuff like that. I'm sure we're going to get into it like later when we're talk about people like Stanislav Grof and everything. But so he's gone to architecture school. When does he slowly begin that transition into, being a artist as we know him now?
So it's kind of on the 60s, 70s cusp. He got into poster making. So one of his friends, Kunz, he was the co-owner of Switzerland's first poster publishing company. And because his work really kind of spoke to that kind of psychedelic zeitgeist, especially sort of his Passages series, which he printed in editions in different color combinations, as well as his Biomechanoid series, which showed kind of women, like female creatures blending into machines. They started doing obviously the birth machine as well, although that is a tiny bit later. But they did very well as posters. So it was, I think, a suggestion that he could actually make a living out of being an artist. And when he started receiving more and more commissions, he realized that he couldn't moonlight anymore. So he quit. He quit his first job, and he was already becoming part of the kind of Swiss counterculture, the Swiss underground. He had many friends, and they were doing various things. So a lot of theatre people. So Lee Tobler, his fated love, he met in 66, if I'm not mistaken. She had a lot of artistic friends. They moved into a shared flat in Zurich. He was kind of supporting her as she was an aspiring actor. He also met different people who were interested in Freudian psychoanalysis. So kind of all of these ideas swishing around. And it's really throughout his life, he was kind of always meeting weird, wonderful people who inspired him. And a really important influence as well is literature. I had the privilege of visiting his house in Zurich in Erlich.
Oh, I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous.
I had this most incredible after hours tour by torchlight, thanks to his widow, Carmen Giger, who is the director of his museum in Gruyere. And just, seeing the stuff that was on his shelves there, it was a lot of literature. And initially, during his relationship with Lee Tobler, what she used to do is she used to read to him while he worked. She was kind of training her voice and, for the theatre, but also inspiring him. So you'll see references to H.P. Lovecraft, Tolkien in his works. I mean, Aleister Crowley as well. Obviously, a lot of other authors, and then that's kind of a topic for another conversation. So in other words, from the very start, his work was really intertextual and drawing on a bunch of different things. So it's little wonder that it keeps cropping up in these completely different scenes. And it's really, I think, with the Alien film that he attained this international reputation. And the things that he did following that, his collaboration with artists like, Debbie Harry really put him into that kind of 80s more inflected countercultural consciousness. And obviously the stuff that he continued to do for Hollywood, not all of it came off the ground, but another film that he did design was Species in the mid-90s. And he kind of continued to work really until his dying day. A big turning point was the launch of the Giger Museum in the late 90s. And he produced all of the fittings for that, all of the kind of furniture for that. And it was privately funded. So, funded that. It was part family money, part sort of savings, but it was very much kind of his desire to create his space, his world. And when a medieval chateau came on the market in Gruyere, he was like, this is it. So that kind of became a place of
Yeah.
pilgrimage for him, and that's something that an incredible place again that I visited during their 25th anniversary celebrations this year over the summer, and it's just this incredible coming together of all of it really. His visual art, his architecture, his furniture, his sort of decorative design, and importantly, it also houses his art collection. So the stuff that he enjoyed, and it has an exhibition space for artists who share that ethos, which is still in. So,
And just as a question, like he's moving it from the late 60s into the early 70s, and at this point, he seems to have already developed a very distinct visual style. Like, what is he both visually pulling from, what's inspiring him, but like what's kind of, obviously with Giger there's a lot of like metatextual, like you call them like leitmotifs throughout his entire work. Where is he kind of pulling this from? I know the story about them in terms of his obsession with, you know, Egypt, about the story about going to see the mummy with his sister when he was quite young, but like what is he really pulling from? I've also seen Dark Star where he talks about the skull that he got when he was 6 and dragging it along the ground with a string, you know.
absolutely. Another really important influence was music, in fact, jazz. Like he was a hardcore jazz fan. He loved experimental jazz and the actual structure of musical instruments such as saxophones, that kind of, organic quality with kind of clavicles and mechanical bits, that really influenced his work. And that comes out in his saxophonist sculpture as well, where the instrument becomes the character. And
Yeah.
Trains were another one. He was really into trains, and in fact, he built his own kind of ghost train within his house that he could coming out of bed and go around the house. And he wanted to recreate that in the museum. He basically wanted the museum to be one big kind of ghost ride. But that sadly never happened out of conservation and cost concerns. So that's another one. So kind of everything that we associate with kind of the long 19th century and industrialization, the train as a kind of symbol of modernity almost. And other things, I mean, certainly the work of other artists. He loved the symbolists. He references many of them, most famously Arnold Böcklin in his work, Art Nouveau, so architecture. The Gothic, again, architecture, sacred architecture. I'd say there is a great deal of kind of anti-clericalism in his work. So actually coming from a Catholic canton, a sort of Swiss-German Catholic canton in Switzerland, and growing up in that time where there was certainly a move away from religion that continued to fuel him. But another influence really is the women in his life, the important relationships in his life, and you see how the features and kind of the shape of the Giger woman changes over the years, depending on whom he is sharing his life with. So really the feminine, the female form, and in the same way that it inspired Art Nouveau, the sinuous kind of opium smoke aesthetic of Art Nouveau was very much kind of inspired by the New Woman. So all of these influences really, really kind of come together, but they do so in a kind of very individualistic way. I mean, there are imitators, but there's only one Giger, right?
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Sanoderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Sanoderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Sanoderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Sanoderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Sanoderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical-grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Sanoderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Sanoderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Sanoderm products or for more information.
Another really important influence behind Giger's work is the Swiss landscape. And quite famously, one of the reasons he didn't do a lot more work for Hollywood is because he refused to move there. He would not betray native Switzerland with its rolling hills and valleys and mountain peaks for the motopolis of LA. He was just not prepared to do that. He loved Switzerland, and most importantly, he loved Gruyere, and that is where he is buried within earshot of the museum, actually. So
it seems strange that, because on first sight, his work doesn't seem particularly pastoral. You know, like I can sort of imagine a universe in which Giger's very excited by LA. But yeah, the kind of rolling hills of Switzerland doesn't.
But before you say that, Matt, I think it actually makes sense, because when you look at his art, like there's not a whole lot of hardness to it. Although he's playing with motifs of like metal and synthetic materials, it's not concrete. It's no. I would call it like, the exact opposite of brutalism, that it has this like soft curvature, although it's made with these hard, cold materials.
The word nostalgia was coined initially to describe the sensation or the malady that Swiss soldiers had when they were away from the Alps. Right?
I can understand that.
Yeah, like it was literally like, why are these young Swiss boys like so sad? It must be because they can't hear cowbells anymore. Right, like that was the original kind of like diagnosis of nostalgia, was in Swiss enlistees being far away from home, and they did think it was either the altitude or the lack of cowbells that was causing the nostalgia, the kind of homesickness. So yeah, maybe Giger was worried about that. He wanted to be near the cowbells.
He wanted to be near the cowboys. I mean, he is from Heidi country, so it's all there. It's all there. But he works with the landscape a lot. So if you look at the construction of sort of the visual universe of Alien, but also of the greatest movie never made, Jodorowsky's Dune, a lot of that is the way the landscape is constructed. There's a sense of the mountainous. There's a sense of kind of undulation, and he had entire series dedicated to these spaces, which are they are not urban, so they could be distant moons, or they could be landscapes seared by nuclear weapons, but still it is nature. Even if it's destroyed, it's natural.
Also in when you look at his landscapes, the idea of like monumentality as well, that I think you look at anything in the Swiss Alps and you can just be overwhelmed with this scale, in the same way when you look at his paintings, when he's drawing when he's painting, large pieces, there's this idea of like something so big that you're like looking up at it in the same way you look up at a mountain.
And I guess his work, this is something I'd be interested to see what you think about, Miro, but like I also don't think his work is, at least not straightforwardly, dystopian. Like there's not an obvious or kind of like didactic dystopianism in his work. I mean, there's certainly some horror and some anxiety, some sort of techno anxiety in places, but it's not exactly kind of utopian. He's not kind of in these biomechanical forms and things. He's not a kind of fetishist of cyborgs, for example. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like a kind of straightforwardly horrific, right?
I agree with you. To me, his work is much more representative of states of mind than of actual kind of imagined scenes. So for that reason, I don't really like the label fantastic realist, because what Giger is trying to convey, to my mind, is a kind of a new sensibility of hyperconnectivity, of greater technological intervention, quite importantly in the human body in the form of contraception. And that he was actually part of the kind of pro-contraception debate in Switzerland. He has sort of political, like almost political cartoons that are sort of praising, the ability to control whether a woman conceives and stuff like that. So kind of moving beyond this idea of what is it, the famous Kinder, Küche, Kirche,
Yeah.
kind of moving beyond that and saying that actually women can be creatures of leisure and pleasure in their own right, that they can control, when they choose to have a family. That was seen as extremely radical and arguably still is in Switzerland, where I think like the last canton to give women the vote did so in like 80 something or 90 something, I don't have my facts ready, but very conservative country. So certainly like the technological does not necessarily mean the singularity. It can quite literally mean whether or not you can legally have an IUD fitted.
And like, I think it's an interesting kind of connection, and once again me making big brain connections of Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow and the idea of metalism, that like the fusing of the body with the machine, whereas like Pynchon proposed that as this kind of like fatalistic and kind of nihilistic end to like the progress of technology, whereas I feel like Giger has this kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say optimistic, but it's much more, I don't know,
accepting.
Yeah. It's like forward looking, looking at the future with anxiety, but not necessarily despair.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, there's a lot of that in the kind of culture at the time, right? As well, like think about William Gibson in particular with Neuromancer and Cronenberg. And I think that's, to move on to tattooing, I guess, is what I think so interesting about where tattooing like finds so much influence from Giger, because from kind of inspiring, perhaps even kind of completely kind of inventing that biomechanical style that would become so iconic of the 90s, to I was thinking about Paul Booth in particular, who I saw. I'd never seen those photos, Miro, of Paul Booth and with Giger. I thought that was really incredible. And Loretta Lou, Swiss tattooing kind of matriarch at that meeting of him as well. But I was really surprised, even as early as like 1989, to see that Spider Webb, artistic tattooing, forefather of kind of conceptual tattooing, was interested in Giger stuff in the late 80s. And it seems that the tattooists who took up his style, either directly or in the styles that came in the wake of that, were also not. It's not straightforwardly horror. It's not straightforwardly sci-fi. It's not straightforwardly kind of dystopian or nihilistic. It has this kind of almost kind of seductive, Ballardian almost as well. I think it's no surprise that the guy that edited Modern Primitives in the 1980s also was obsessed with J.G. Ballard. Right? These kind of body modification, new generations of tattooing beginning in the late 70s, early 80s are combining with this ambiguous perspective on technology and the relationship between technology and and bodies. Like it's not straightforwardly, I think. And again, I think a lot of the way that naively the stuff might get written about is as like, you know, techno utopian or kind of transcendent of the flesh or something. But actually, Giger's kind of ambiguity in that space is one of the things, it seems to me, that was perhaps so exciting for the tattooists who found his work so inspirational.
We see a real shift between the 70s when his biomechanical style really launched and the 90s, in the sense that in the 70s he was looking forward and sort of, you know, looking forward to a distant and fearful future that wouldn't be a reality aesthetically or otherwise for most people, to the 90s where it is the culture, it's the style, you know, the Matrix really set the pace for the 2000s in many ways. It's not just the 90s, it's beyond that. And people are actually starting to talk about cyberspace in the mainstream. It's no longer the purview of I don't know, scientists.
Or the military.
Or the military, indeed. So it does seem like every kind of subsequent generation of Giger fans or collaborators discover something relevant in his work for the times.
I mean, on the tattooing stuff, I was quite interested to see how kind of connected he was to that appropriation and use of his work. Like, he obviously shows up a lot in tattoo magazines, and you know, as we just mentioned, was meeting with some of the tattoo artists who were most responsible. But I was also struck by, and again, I hadn't seen these, some of the photos that you sent over from the 60s and 70s of like body painting projects that he was doing.
Body art.
I had no idea about
so beautiful.
Those.
It's so good.
I had absolutely no idea about those, and that was part of his practice. Can you tell us a bit about those? And like, because I think I'm sure that people like Paul Booth and Guy Aitchison and Bob Tyrrell and all these people like didn't know about that stuff either, right? They were consuming Giger through Alien and through posters and through Taschen books. But like, it seems that Giger's already sort of aware that that there's something interesting about the canvas of the human body with his, you know, aesthetic and then with his political sensibilities. So yeah, can you talk us through these body painting projects? Because the first one that you sent pictures over was from 1967.
That's right. So, as I mentioned, Giger was part of the kind of Swiss underground art scene, and a lot of that was kind of about crossover projects. So, working with theatre people, with musicians, with photographers.
And this was happening in the European avant-garde at the time. The Vienna Actionists, exactly the same time in '67. There are people in Berlin and in Paris and in London doing similar stuff. I don't know if Giger was tapped into those networks, presumably at least peripherally, right? These kind of avant-garde performance networks of the 60s and 70s.
He was certainly aware, as his library attests, and he was always interested in just kind of weird stuff. So he wasn't just about, you know, producing artworks and installing them for the bourgeois' enjoyment or disgust. He was all about kind of collaborating with people that he vibed with. So these kind of body painting projects came out of those collaborations, and some of them would have been done in his studio in Oerlikon. It's a northeastern suburb of Zurich, where his house still is. And some of them would have been done in galleries or kind of in other spaces and documented. And the idea of the human body as a canvas is really one that runs through his entire body of work, like a stick of Brighton rock, because that is what his work is all about, really, that kind of the merging between organicity and anatomy and technology. But it's fair to say he's interested in technology insofar as it kind of affects the human body. And a lot of his artworks are about the actual merging of the human body with technology, whether in a kind of sexual act like the early biomechanoids, or in the form of kind of new species like the xenomorph, which still kind of has elements of the human anatomy. I mean, he's still kind of standing on two, or it is still standing on kind of two legs and kind of has arms and a head. So the body painting kind of preceded that, and it became more and more sophisticated, because if the 1967 works were kind of a lot more kind of free form and kind of painterly, if we look at his collaboration with Debbie Harry in 1981, so her and Chris Stein actually came to Giger's home and studio to work on the Cuckoo video, where he created this specific like bodysuit for her and kind of facial makeup. There's a book that just came out detailing that collaboration, and if anyone is interested in that, do look it up. It's called Metamorphosis, and it's about kind of that entire collaboration and the importance of kind of body art. One thing I should say, it wasn't just about the body. So he was really interested in facial features and kind of how they can be transformed artistically, but also how they can be kind of brought up almost in a pareidolia sense.
Yeah, because these pictures of Debbie Harry don't look like Debbie Harry, like at all. If you didn't know they were Debbie Harry, it'd take you a while to realise that it was Debbie Harry with this incredible painting on her body.
In the earlier stuff, you see that there are also he's also working with the male body.
Yeah.
So it's not just women, and there are some really cool pictures in the archive of Giger having a mud bath in a resort in Switzerland where he's entirely covered in this mud, and like he's taking pictures of that and documenting it. So he was clearly really interested in kind of in that really in transformation of the human body. And it's fair to say like he was a pretty hands-on individual. Like it wasn't just like pretty much everything that he sketched out, he would then try to implement. So like the ghost train, like initially it was a sketch, but then he actually built it with his own hands. So anything that, he can get his hands into and be very hands-on with, he would try to put in action. And it's kind of a very hands-on, tactical, spontaneous form of art.
I mean, you showed me pictures of his house where with all of his sculptures and all of his, like, he's clearly kind of building a world around himself, even in his domestic spaces, let alone in his artistic spaces, right?
And I think as well, like something that particularly with the body painting that connects to tattooing quite a lot is you can see kind of links between the way he paints the body and the emergence later of, like we talked about the other evening, Matt, with the modern primitives movement. Like it is using kind of design motifs that you could see be influenced by quote unquote tribal designs and traditional tattooing designs in terms of like actual tattooing or scarification. And it kind of is this, I don't know, techno primitive, techno tribal kind of idea.
Yeah, and that was something that, politically was quite divisive, I think, in the tattoo community. The kind of again, this kind of utopian optimism thing continues to be a dividing line between different sections of the tattoo community. I mean, do you get a sense, Mira, on the tattoo side of things, that he was into it? I mean, like, obviously he just from the interviews with him in tattoo magazines, and he's clearly kind of excited and interested by the fact that his designs and his work is inspiring tattooers. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on what he thought about tattooing per se. I mean, you said he was interested in his own body. Do you have a sense of like what he thought about tattooing himself? Like whether he was sort of just interested that other people were using his work, or whether he had some more direct kind of artistic engagement with it?
So from the research that I've been able to do from secondary sources, essentially, it's clear that he was interested in tattooing as a form of counterculture, as a kind of subversive form of expression.
Yeah.
And he went to tattoo conventions at one point, like he was actually a part of the East Coast tattoo scene. So in the mid-90s, he went to Incredible NYC. He went to Woodstock. I mean, all of this stuff is documented in the tattoo magazines. He kind of gave a few short interviews where he was kind of very positive about seeing his work, not just copied by tattoo artists, but even recombined and interpreted. There's a bit in one of the magazines where he said, if it's not done well, then he feels sorry for the person wearing it, which is something that you've mentioned a bit on this podcast. So I'm sure that you can agree with that sentiment. So he's quoted as saying, "Tattooing is an underground art. I started paying attention to it only when I was shown images of my old paintings, mostly the airbrush ones, so the ones from the 70s, on people's arms, legs, backs, or other parts of their bodies. Since then, I look through all the tattoo magazines to find new variations." He's really interested, but it's a self-interest. Like, he's interested in tattooing insofar as it's tattoos like of his works.
That was, I think, the what I was getting at with my question. I mean, it's clear, like, it's clear people were, Felix Liu was tattooing stuff based on or in Giger S style from the early 80s. Like, it's really clear that a generation of post 70s tattooers, when the kind of postmodern era of tattooing begins, I suppose, begin to really lean into to what he's doing and become super excited about it. I definitely saw, particularly after, again, Paul Booth in particular, it became so famous and so influential for doing that kind of big horror black and grey stuff. But of course, like anything, any art, not just tattooing, the bad versions of that, the kind of diluted versions that are done by much less skillful artists with much less care, it's the kind of thing that, I mean, all tattooing is easy to do badly, but like that very dimensional black and grey that's making kind of at least moves to use the anatomy of the body for its structure, it's the kind of thing that in good hands like Booth's, it's absolutely spectacular. In bad hands, like your average local tattoo artist, it's not going to go so well.
Agreed. And actually, Giger said in one of the interviews that a good tattoo should move with the body.
Yeah.
So he was really aware of the plastic dimension of tattoos based on his painting, on his artworks. A really obvious link between tattooing and Giger's work is the airbrush and the tattoo gun, and how similar they are in principle, but also in the way that they look. And I think that appealed to him because watching the process, I mean, there are quite a few pictures of him watching people get tattooed at like conventions. Like, he was clearly kind of fascinated by the parallels there. And the tattoo gun appears in some of his artwork. So it's not just a case of his being tattooed onto people's skin. It's a case of tattooing inspiring his own artwork. So I think he did a series of the birth machine babies where they are actually holding tattoo guns. In the earlier work, it's kind of ambiguous what it is that they're holding, but in the sculpture editions that he did of the birth machine babies, it's clear that they have kind of like a cable going from the needle.
Don't say tattoo gun, you'll get cancelled by the tattoo industry. Tattoo machine. Tattoo machine only. No, I think you're because also, and I want to come on to Eastern Europe in a second as well. But on that kind of interest in the process of tattooing, the other thing that's always struck me about his work, and I hadn't totally connected it until you were just talking, his work's quite bloodless, right? Like, it's not very. Although there is definitely kind of sadomasochistic elements in it, and there's definitely kind of that kind of fleshy embodiedness to his work. A lot of the kind of uncanniness of his work is its kind of bloodlessness, and it's interesting to me that maybe that he said he may sort of getting interested in looking at people getting tattooed, because actually his work doesn't have a lot of or any that I remember, like kind of corporeal violence in it. It doesn't seem to have a lot of blood or biological pain obviously in it, even whilst clearly there's a kind of undertone or even overtone of that in the work, right?
I think if you look across the spectrum of his work, there are certainly scenes of torture and penetration, whether with objects or organs. Yeah. He was definitely sort of gruesomely interested, but also scared of all of this stuff. It's kind of that duality where you kind of you put your hand over your eyes, but you're kind of looking through the fingers. There is a sense of that. So I wonder if that element almost of kind of torture practice appealed to.
Yeah, but it's quite kind of. It's as I say, quite kind of bloodless, right? Like it has kind of penetration and it has interaction between the mechanical and the biological, but in a way that is not, I don't know, Cronenbergian, for example, or is not it's not body horror in the same way.
Well, I think maybe the difference between where Cronenberg and Giger diverge is that like Cronenberg, it seems much more is about like the not introversion, but the kind of like the foreignness of something in the body that isn't supposed to be there, whereas like his work seems like these are organic things that have developed naturally. And it's funny because Games Workshop, the developers of Warhammer, completely misinterpreted his work when they used him as the inspiration for the Mechanicus, because the Mechanicus have robot parts put on them, and they've said that Giger is a huge inspiration, but I don't think they really understood it.
Yeah, I mean that we should do a whole episode about Games Workshop, because that's also sort of interesting.
No, we will. They will send lawyers after us because they fucking hate anyone doing anything with their property.
I wonder if the sense of bloodlessness comes from the fact that most of his work, most famous work, is monochrome.
I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Black and white, which is why it looks so great as a tattoo, because the transition is almost minimal, from that kind of airbrushed monochrome image to kind of an ink tattoo.
Mm-hmm. And I think as well, there's a certain inspiration of like aero design as well. Like I know he studied architecture, but like the kind of smoothness of aeronautical design and the smoothness of the way the machine intermingles with the human in his artwork. I think at that time, when you're moving from the 70s into the 80s, there was the movement away from the kind of clunky, large design. Matt's going to interrupt me in a second, I can tell, of the 50s and 60s, moving into this kind of futuristic design of the 70s onwards, where like everything seems like natural and ergonomic, and it's like seems to be flowing from one thing to the next.
Well, this comes back to something you said earlier on, actually, as well, which is that, and I say all the time, that tattooing reflects the visual cultures around it, right? And so, yeah, tattooing in the 50s is not very popular, well, not as popular as it had been potentially in the 20s and 30s, because visual culture is much more modernist and sleek and kind of less interested in filigree and fuss. And I think, as the kind of visual culture universe that Giger is injecting himself into, like through film and through posters and through graphic art and other things, like that's the kind of thing that then creates and responds to the context around it.
And I think as well that something that definitely kind of inspired, I think, a lot of musicians and people like Celtic Frost rightfully took from it, is that his art is menacing in a way that doesn't feel threatening. It's menacing because it's so alien and unfamiliar, that there is this kind of, there's a familiarity of form, but it's so abstracted from what's real that, like, I think a musician, someone like Celtic Frost, could look like that, and they were trying to make music that was so intentionally away from everything that was familiar that they kind of connected with it, obviously because Tom worked and still works for the family.
That's very true. I've spoken to a few people who have Giga tattoos. So at the 25th anniversary celebrations at the museum HR Giga in Gruyere, they actually had two tattoo artists working during the festival. Dirk Binder and Denise Del Conte, a German and a Swiss tattoo artist. So there was kind of like a real space in the program for acknowledging the fact that there is kind of an offshoot of Giga's world, which is tattooing, which I think is great, really. And when I spoke to people who already had tattoos, and quite often they would have gotten them at other anniversaries at the museum, my real question was sort of, what made you get Giga tattoos, right? And almost invariably, it's not a very like thought out answer. It's very kind of obvious and intuitive, because it's beautiful, because it looks great. So what Giga fans across the board agree on is that his work is aesthetic, it is beautiful, but it's the kind of aesthetic that doesn't appeal to everyone. But the people who get it, they really get it, and they think it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. And that's certainly how I felt when I first came into contact with it. And how like a lot of people who really got into it, like even like Ridley Scott, who, a copy of the Necronomicon slid across his desk when he was despairing about how to kind of design the alien universe. And he was like, this is the answer. This is it. So Giga is clearly like it. He's the answer to a question we can't quite formulate, but I feel like that answer is beauty rather than any of the kind of more intellectual frameworks that we use to kind of explain what he's all about.
I want to ask you, sort of following on from that a little bit, of like what is it about the real interest in his work in Eastern Europe then? Because like lots of the tattoo magazines that you sent over are from my friend Piotr's magazine Tatuage from Poland, like. And obviously, you encountered him in the context of Ukraine. Like what Boris from Hungary back in the early 2000s, a really important kind of again pioneer of this style. And even today, like a lot of artists from Russia and from the former Eastern Bloc, like seem to be working in a kind of black and grey style that is at least, if not directly, in the legacy of Giga in tattooing. So what is it particularly, do you think, about Eastern Europe and post-Soviet Europe that is particularly amenable, that speaks to, that Giga speaks to there?
Well, Giga is a figurative artist. Yeah. He is not an abstract artist, and he is someone with great technical skill. And I would say, like in the former Soviet Union, especially, where kind of the visual paradigm remained figurative, where kind of modernism didn't really touch the visual arts. And socialist realism maintained that kind of 19th century tradition of academic painting. The appreciation for figurative art, it never waned. And another important element, I think, is especially kind of in countries that are predominantly Orthodox Christian, the kind of the influence of icons, of that sacred, of that visual language of sacred art that affects what people generally tend to think is aesthetic. So for that reason, Giga doesn't seem as there isn't. I think there are fewer critics than in the West. There is a kind of consensus that everybody should have moved on from this already.
I mean, we spoke a while ago to Julia about tattooing in Spain, right? And obviously, like, there's this kind of persistent idea in tattoo scholarship about the tattoo renaissance in the 70s, which I'm very skeptical of, historiographically speaking. But in Spain, it makes real sense because they didn't have any tattoo industry until after Franco. And interestingly enough, that coincides pretty much with this general idea of when the tattoo renaissance is meant to have happened in the early 70s. And I wonder if there's something similar going on with the kind of, I mean, not that Eastern Europe was completely isolated artistically from everywhere else, but like actually Giga's very popular in tattooing and otherwise in the late 80s, early 90s when Glasnost and Perestroika and the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc., is happening, right? So it's sort of a bit of an interesting historical coincidence is probably too strong, but like this is the thing. This is almost the first stuff that's available. If you're if you're starting a tattoo shop in Poland or in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia or whatever in like 1991 or 1992, if you're buying tattoo magazines from America or Britain or France or Germany, you're going to see stuff about Giga or about biomechanical stuff in general, and that's going to be the hottest, coolest shit on the planet. So I wonder if there's a historical kind of just coincidence there that the first moment that you're able to have a visible tattoo industry in Eastern Europe is also the first time that at the same time that Giga style tattooing through the works of Paul Booth, who, as I remember being on the pretty much every tattoo magazine ever, and like opening up those magazines and going, oh my god, I've never seen anything like that in 1992, 1993. That there were people the same age as me, 13, 14-year-olds in Poland and the Czech Republic and anywhere else having those same experiences, right?
Very much so. And there's a lot to be said for kind of aspiring to catch up.
Right, yeah.
With the West. And in many ways, Giga represents something Western European and refined and sort of untouched really by any kind of association with Soviet authorities. And, you had an amazing episode about, Russian criminal tattoos. A great fan of Fuel Publishing contributed to their Looking for Lenin book about the removal of Lenin statues from public spaces in Ukraine. And, that is an example of a tattooing language that is, almost a part of that culture, even if it's kind of an undercurrent. Whereas Giga represents something completely different. So if you're going to horrify your parents by getting a tattoo, you want to do it in the way that would make you become a part of a youth culture that is Western, really, and has no associations with the criminal world in the former.
And I guess doesn't have a huge amount of association with like mainstream Western culture either, for the reasons you talked about earlier on. That he's this guy who did have this huge, long, prolific career, but was really almost exclusively taken seriously by subculture and by Hollywood, and not by mainstream visual arts, which is a topic for another day in a way. But that helps him be visible and accessible, and you can buy books with his stuff in, from any bookshop. Certainly you could in the 90s, but at the same time it's not boring and mainstream and conventional. It gets to be kind of both popular and underground almost at the same time in some ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder also about kind of the wider context of like if you have a Giga tattoo, it is likely that you're into heavy music or bikes. It is likely that as a guy you have long hair or no hair, and it is likely that you like other cool underground shit. It is likely that you may be wearing leather, so it's kind of, it feeds into a way of life, an aesthetic sensibility that goes beyond tattooing, beyond art. It's kind of like a club almost. The other film, I mean, we mentioned Dark Star, but there's the other film, H.R. Giga Revealed, has a great number of tattoo artists commenting about, how important he is. I mean, almost all American, if I remember correctly. So in many cases, I don't think it served his artistic reputation to be championed by members of the tattooing scene. And that's something that, I think the Giga estate is certainly aware of. At one point, there was a book in the works HR Giga Under Your Skin, and it was supposed to come out in the late 90s, early 2000s. And kind of the guy behind it was Leslie Barony, who was Giga's US dealer. And the project never, I mean, the idea was to take photos of Giga tattoos around the world and kind of show how, you know, Giga is this, you know, kind of influence behind tattooing art. And not everybody in Giga Circle was in favor of this project. And there were different reasons for that. I mean, one objection that was cited was that, you know, we don't need to encourage those people anymore. Like, we want to, you know, like they are already with us. You know, what we need to do is, you know, we need to pitch to kind of serious institutions and actually elevate his reputation. And this book would do the opposite. But the other really interesting bit, and I think, Matt, this is something that you have spoken about, is this idea of ownership. So, you know, someone close to Giga who was working with him kind of raised the objection. So you're basically publishing this book and giving people license to like steal your work because they're not paying you, are they? So what is this all about? You know, this is not a savvy business move. And arguably, Giga's entire life was about figuring out what the savvy business move should be and doing the exact opposite. But you know, it never happened for that reason, because, you know, who has ownership of those works? You know, is it Giga for having created that original? Is it the tattoo artist for having, you know, created the tattoo? Is it the person carrying that tattoo that's literally part of their bodies? Well, I would say that the Church of Giga is a broad church and everyone is welcome. And it's not about pushing certain people or certain groups of people out. It's rather about giving more people access. And we are kind of in a new phase of promoting Giga's legacy. 2024 marks 10 years since his death. And in many ways, it's sort of long enough to have a little bit of distance and kind of historical distance and seeing his work as a whole. So a lot of that work is about having his work featured in reputable art institutions. Whether or not tattoo fans come is not really the issue. They are very welcome. It's more about, you know, art. But we're not really at that stage yet where Giga is dissociated from underground culture. He's still kind of very much a part of that and primarily celebrated within the underground culture. I mean, that's not a monolithic thing, but that's sort of what I mean. A really cool thing I wanted to mention as we kind of wind down is the fact that Giga was mentioned in a novel by William Gibson that was published in 1993 called Virtual Light. Do you know about this? So William Gibson was Giga's favorite sci-fi writer, and yeah, he's the author of Necromancer, Mona Lisa, Overdrive, and there is a dialogue set in a tattoo parlor in the year 2005. Yeah, and it goes, Lowell, he's got a Giga. A Giga? This painter, like 19th century or something, real classical, biomech. So, you know, it's... So Giga he's kind of echoing into the future, but he is now kind of part of the past. And the enduring appeal of Giga is that he has this fluidity. You know, he could conceivably have come from the 19th century, from Art Nouveau. But then again, he could also have come from the distant future and, you know, had been transported to us by means of a time machine. And yet he was a guy who grew up in bourgeois cantonal Switzerland in the 50s and 60s. So it's really, time will tell. But his work, I think, stands on its own 2 feet, is able to defend itself by virtue of its quality, whether or not it attracts weirdos.
Thanks, Miro, for coming on the show. And if you enjoyed this episode, where can people find you online or read your work or find your work?
Oh, absolutely. I'm on Instagram and academia, and you can find me by searching for miroslava.hartman.
I'm sure if anyone sees any Giga-related event that's happening in the UK, you will probably be there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. As I've said, huge fan of the podcast. Many, many good years to you.
Thank you very much. And if you enjoyed this episode, I have to give a shout out to our patrons at the £10 and above tier. Let's see if I can do it in one breath like normal. Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Shit Jesus, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, Jordan Best, Jess Goodman, James Schick, and Charlie Lightning. I can do that better now because I quit smoking. Thank you to every one of you, and thank you to all our patrons for listening to this episode. I also forgot to do the intro at the start like I always fucking do. And yeah, if you don't already, follow us on Instagram, Beneath Skin Pod. Thank you very much. Goodbye.